Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Chris Deeran,
Right.
Director of Enlighten, Scotland's non-partisan independent think tank. Could you all mute yourselves, please, just in case there's any background noise? We had a huge amount of people signing up to today's event, which I think tells us something about both the level of interest and the level of concern in relation to Scotland's finances and the challenges and opportunities the nation faces. So we're here because yesterday, Shona Robeson, the Finance Secretary, delivered the final Holyrood budget before May's election. It was obviously a chance for the SNP to set out its offer ahead of May's election. It's an incredibly useful and powerful tool for any party in government to have at its disposal this close to the polls. And I think I'm sure we were all paying attention that the budget was an attempt to address these challenging issues of tax, public sector pay, local government funding, money for health and education, capital projects, the ongoing cost of living crisis, amongst other things. The budgets are always complex occasions, and for those of us who are not natural economists, they can be a bit of a head scratcher. You're aware there's stuff hidden in the fine print, and it can be quite difficult to ferret it out, which is why we're delighted to have with us as our guest today Professor Graeme Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, whose gimlet eye misses nothing, and who is here to share his insights and analysis with us. We're very grateful for Graeme being here and for, I think, hopefully an ongoing series of events where we can discuss these big fiscal moments and other issues with the enlightened audience. So Graeme's going to start by talking for a bit. Being an economist, he has a number of slides, of course. That's his comfort blanket, and I will try and understand them. Some of you will be better at it than I will. And then he and I will have a chat. We really, really want to hear your questions, though, which you can submit using the chat function on Zoom. And keep them coming as early as you'd like, and we'll get through as many as we can before the hour's up. So with that, Graeme, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Chris, and thanks very much for the opportunity to come along and chat once again with you and colleagues in Enlighten. And what I want to do, if it's okay, is give you a bit of a picture about the core elements within the budget. So we'll talk a bit about what's the overall funding looking like for the budget, what's happening to spending, what the government doing on tax, and in the end talk a bit about social security. So as you're right, I will give you some pictures and some charts to hopefully help you see some of the broad messages that are going on, and then really keen to get into some questions and chat about some of the issues that it's raised. So I guess the first question is what's happening to the government's budget? What's happening to funding? As you know, the Scottish budget is increasingly complex with a whole host of different mechanisms driving how much money the government have in a budget time period, from the block grant, from devolved taxes, from various mechanisms the government can use to try and smooth spending, such as the Scotland Reserve and things like that. I guess once you kind of cut through all of that, the picture is, well, what is happening to overall spending? And there's probably two stories here that are useful to highlight. So this chart here just presents you our core budget table about what we think is happening to the Scottish Government's budget. Total funding along the top, and then I've given you some what I call day-to-day funding, so resource funding, and then also something called day-to-day funding for public services. So that's essentially removing the social security line and just thinking about, well, what's the money there for health, education, and the like. And it's a bit of a complex table, but I guess the key thing is to look at what's happening to the real terms growth rates year on year in terms of the budget. And you can see that these numbers are relatively small, they're relatively weak. So if you take day-to-day funding, so the resource budget of the Scottish Government is only growing by just over 1% from this year into next year. And actually, if you look across the entire forecast period we look at, we only think that the budget is growing by just over 1% year on year. And once you account for social security, which I'll show you takes up quite a significant amount of that growth, the overall growth in the budget that's available for health, education, economic development and the like is growing very, at a very slow pace over the next few years. So 0.2% in real terms in 2026, 2027, and actually shrinking slightly from 2027, 2028. So I guess the core message that we're talking about is that the Cabinet Secretary is essentially dealing with a very challenging fiscal envelope once again, and that story hasn't really changed from where we were this time last year. So that's the overall resource budget. So that's the budget for day-to-day spending. What's happened to the capital budget? And you've probably heard some chat over the recent days about how the capital budget was even more challenging. So this presents the outlook for the government's capital budget. Again, the top line just shows you what's happening to total funding. The second theme there is what's happening to the capital element within that. And while the total budget, as I said, is growing, and while resource budget is growing in there, if you look at the very bottom row there, you can see a very challenging outlook for the capital budget over the next 4 years. So growth next year of just under 3% in real terms, but then cuts to the capital budget through the end of the end of the decade. And that means that the government are essentially going to have really quite difficult conversations about what they prioritize within their capital investment budget, because they're going to have less to spend in real terms on the capital budget toward the end of the decade than they do just now. And just to put that in terms of a picture so you can see it perhaps really quite easily, if you look at day-to-day funding here, so this is a resource budget, nominal budget between now and the end of our forecast horizon on track to rise by over 15%. But once you adjust for inflation, the growth is just over 5%. So, and again, not jumping to some of the things I'll talk about, if your overall resource budget is only growing by 5% over 5 years, that means that you're going to have to make some really difficult conversations around pay, difficult decisions around how much you put into core portfolios like the health budget, education, and the like. And if you choose to prioritize some areas with above real terms increases, then that means you're going to have to face some quite difficult challenges and choices elsewhere. And that essentially is going to be one of the themes that I'll talk about, and one of the themes I think about that will dominate the election debate and what comes next. One thing I just want to highlight to you, and without going into the detail too much on this, but I think this is quite important because you mentioned you scratch your head about sometimes about how money is moved around within budgets. And this is quite a technical table, but it's one thing that's quite important to try and just be aware of and just understand when we're looking at whether budgets are increasing or decreasing. And because what happens, and Chris, I think you've probably commented on this before, is that what happens when a government sets out a budget and the budget gets passed at the start of the year doesn't guarantee they're going to do exactly what they say they'll do throughout the year. And what happens is that money gets moved around over the course of the year, and then some gets added into some budgets, some gets moved into other budgets. So that at the end of the year, what you've actually done is slightly different from what you said you were going to do in the first place. So the government have, to be fair, have made some progress in that now what they do is when they present their budget allocation, so when they're talking about what they'll do in 2026, 2027, they now compare to the most recent period that they've got the most recent up-to-date data, and that's called something called the autumn budget revision. So that's given by that first column there. So what that first column there shows you is on the most recent data, what are the Scottish Government spending in 2025, 26 in these core portfolios. So you see in health and social care, it's just over 20 billion at 20 billion, 157 million. Now, what they've done is they've made an update to that and they've improved that. However, there are some routine transfers that still exist that the government haven't baselined, but which do have a material impact upon the overall position. And what that does is it slightly skews some of the results in terms of the relative growth rate you might be thinking between this year and next year. So what we've done to help try and improve transparency is we've kind of essentially reversed some of these transfers so that you're really comparing like for like between 25, 26 and 26, 27. Now, why is all that important? It all sounds very technical and very boring, and actually, well, you're just moving money around. But where it matters is if you look at what is happening to some of the growth rates of some of the portfolios, what we think is about the reality of these growth rates can look different from some of the results that the government have presented. And the key one there, to run two past you there, if you look at for health and social care, so if you look at for health and social care and you compare what the government are saying the real terms growth will be into next year, on the most recent data that they've published, you're looking at about a growth of about 1.5% in real terms. And once you adjust for the routine transfers that we think haven't been baselined, that growth rate is much less. We think it's only going to be about 0.7% there. The flip happens on local government. Local government, when the government's projections expected to decline in real terms between this year and next year, but actually once you adjust for these routine transfers, there's a slight positive growth. So it's just one thing to flag is that it's when people are comparing and seeing which portfolios have done well or portfolios have been protected, it's really important to look carefully about what the baseline is that's being compared to, because some of the adjustments that are made to the baselines can have quite a material impact upon whether a budget is going up or down in a significant way. And that's because governments kind of routinely transfer money between portfolios. A good example of that is that in health and social care, there's some money set aside each year for training for midwifery and for some aspects of nursing. That ultimately gets transferred into the education skills pot, but it appears in the health line. So the health line appears to be doing better than it otherwise would have been, even though we know that transfer is going to take place. So that's just one word of caution, and that we make these adjustments relative to what the government would publish in their headline numbers. Okay, so given all of that, who are the winners and losers from a portfolio perspective in terms of the government spending priorities from this year right to the end of the spending review that they set out? And it's pretty much a familiar story in terms of where current government are setting their priorities for the next few years. So you see that over the next few years, a real terms increase for the health and social care budget, over £1 billion more money going into the health service, more money going into the social justice portfolio. So that's largely investment in social security. So more money flowing into things like the Scottish Child Payment, money flowing into adult disability payment and child disability payment. So more money being prioritised into the social justice portfolio and the health and social care portfolio. What's happening elsewhere? So the part of the budget that is on track to face the biggest real terms cut over the next period of spending review is local government. And then some relatively small cuts spread out across the budget portfolio overall. So again, what have the government done in this budget and in the spending review? I think it's a very familiar story in the sense that they've got a very tight funding envelope. And with that tight funding envelope, they've prioritised health and social care and social justice portfolio. And that means that all the other budgets are seeing relatively smaller increases or having to face real terms cuts over a period of time in order to essentially enable the government to invest in those priorities. And one of the things that we talk about, though, in our report is that first of all, it's really good that the government has set out a spending review. We've not really had a proper spending review for many years now. So the fact that the government have done a spending review and set out in broad terms plans for spending over the next few years is a positive, because it's moving us beyond just purely relying on 1 year budgets. But underpinning some of these numbers are some really quite there are some risks in all of this and some bold ambitions by the government in order to make savings within portfolios. So one of the big things that the government have talked about in this spending review is that over the next 3 years, they hope to save around about £1.5 billion from essentially efficiency savings within portfolios, and they've talked about where these efficiency savings will be within each portfolio. And I guess one of the things that we highlight is that, that £1.5 billion of efficiency savings, it's easy to say that. The proof will come through in actually delivering all of these. Of that 1.5 billion, about £1 billion of those efficiency savings expected to come in from within the health portfolio. And we know the challenges that exist within health in terms of delivery and in terms of reform in there. And essentially, what is underpinning these allocations, or the thinking of the government within these allocations, isn't just a spending review, but it's also that in order to maintain the outcomes that they hope to achieve, is that these portfolios are going to have to achieve quite strong efficiency savings, which obviously, again, might come into this discussion point, is that, well, what happens if you don't achieve these efficiency savings? Do you have to come back and put more money into certain portfolios, or do you have to think about changing the outcomes and level of ambition that you want to have? I think the second thing that we also highlight as a potential risk in this is around public sector pay. And the government has set out a 3-year public sector pay. We're in the pay deal, we're in the second year of that. And that was essentially for a 9% pay award over 3 years, broadly across the public sector. What we've seen over the first 2 years is pay awards that would suggest that you're going to break through that 9% over 3 years when you set your pay award for this time next year. So most of the pay awards are coming in way above 3%, which leaves very limited amount of money within that pay award for the final year that the government have got to allocate. So we estimate around about 1% is all you could really afford in the final year of the pay deal, 27-28, given the pay awards that have come through so far. And that's going to be a real challenge for the government to be able to deliver on a pay award so low. And of course, what that then means is that if you do come through with making a higher pay offer than what you budgeted for, that is just something else that's going to have to be managed within these spending allocations, because the funding level is so tight. There is no additional money. So you have to find the additional money to pay for that pay award within that overall spending envelope. And to give you a kind of a rule of thumb, Chris, because pay accounts for around about half of the overall Scottish budget, every 1% of an additional pay award works out about £275 million for the Scottish Government's budget. So if you break through your pay awards, then that's going to be quite, you're going to have to find quite a lot of additional savings beyond the 1.5 billion you've talked about in order to maintain these spending limits that you set out for yourself. One final just point about pay, which again the government have continued to follow through on, which is quite interesting, is that they're really following through on their plans to essentially cut the number of public sector workers in Scotland. So they've got a target to reduce the number of public sector workers by 0.5% year on year over the next few years over the course of the spending review. And that might sound quite small, 0.5%, but there's a couple of important things that I would say to provide some context. Firstly, it's quite a different outlook for public sector employment than has been historically, particularly since devolution, where we've seen public sector employment rise in Scotland. Secondly, that 0.5% has to come from non-frontline workers. So the government have been quite clear that teachers, nurses, and what they would call frontline workers in the public sector are being protected from those cuts, which means that those savings you do have to make, the job losses you do have to find, have to come from a much smaller pool within the public sector, so in things like the civil service. And in total, even though 0.5% sounds like a small number, that's around about over 13,000 jobs that have to be found from within the overall public sector envelope from back office jobs, and that is potentially going to be a real key area of focus and I think of interest in the post in kind of the post election period. So that's kind of broad overview about funding and spending, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about some of the specifics in all of that. If I could just quickly turn to economy and tax and then on social security. On economy, we've not really changed our forecast too much on the economy. We've kind of moved them around ever so slightly, but the overall story around the economy remains pretty much the same. And it's not because suddenly everything has become nice and stable. You only have to switch on the news to see how global instability and economic shocks are continuing to be the norm. But I guess the point that we're making is that that's what we thought this time last year. So we've not really changed our view that this uncertainty is continuing to lag and to have an impact. One thing I would say is that underpinning all of this is quite a really weak outlook for disposable income for living standards in Scotland, mirroring what's happening in the UK. In the pre-financial crisis period, we could look forward to living standards and disposable income increasing on average each year by around about 3%. Since the financial crisis, that growth has been less than 1% each year, so being around about 0.6% average annual improvement in living standards. And we think that's pretty much going to continue for the foreseeable future. So that not too much change in the economy. What about tax? So clearly, tax is something which has been an area of focus for the government and focus for the debate about what's happening to Scotland's tax position. So this again chart is a bit complicated, but what it does is it shows you what's happening to what's called the net position, the income tax net position for the Scottish government. And what the income tax net position does is, if you recall, the way our fiscal framework works is that essentially the Scottish government get to keep the growth rate and the improvement in Scottish income tax. And what's taken away from the Scottish government's block grant is essentially the improvement and the growth in the tax receipts in the rest of the UK. And what matters then is whether or not we're doing better than the rest of the UK in terms of our tax receipts. And if we are, we get to keep that money. And if we're not, then we're worse off. And that net position can improve for two reasons. It can improve because the Scottish government are taxing people more in Scotland relative to what they would be taxed in the rest of the UK at an aggregate level, or it can be improved because our economy is better off. What's the picture for Scotland for the next few years? So the grey line are previous forecasts we've made. The dotted red line is the forecast we made back in December. The purple line is the forecast we made in June, and the green line is the forecast that we made yesterday. What's the overall story here? Is the overall story is that the Scottish government are raising revenue relative to what would be the case if we hadn't had tax devolution. So they're using their powers to bring in additional monies into the Scottish budget, and we think that kind of revenue will be about £1 billion next year. Interesting, if you look quite closely, that the green line, if you focus on 26, 27, that green line is less than where we thought it was going to be in December 2024 and in June 2025. And the reason for that is that the earnings forecast for the UK has improved significantly relative to the earnings forecast for Scotland. So the green bars are our forecasts for earnings in Scotland. The purple lines are the OBR's forecast for earnings in the UK. And if you look at the green lines, the green bars, we've not really changed our forecast for earnings in Scotland between December and today, whereas the OBR have significantly increased their earnings forecast for the UK. And because of this fiscal framework, because they are now projecting faster growth in revenues in the UK, that narrows the net position that we're going to face in Scotland. And that explains that, what I've highlighted in red there, that difference between the forecast we made back in December and relative to today, where there's been a narrowing of that gap. So the government is still raising additional revenues from their tax policy choices, but they're not raising as much as perhaps we thought it was last year. And we might touch, Chris, a bit in some of the questions about the relative performance of Scotland's economy compared to the UK. And just touching briefly on on tax policies and what the government have announced. So you'll know that the government have announced an uplift in the starter rate and the kind of intermediate rate to increase the thresholds. So to provide some tax cut to those at the lowest end of the income distribution. But what they also announced was a continuation of freezing of the higher rate threshold and the thresholds above that, not just next year, but the next 2 years after that. And I think that is a really interesting story about the changing dynamics of the tax structure within Scotland and the fact that we're seeing many more people in Scotland now moving into becoming higher rate taxpayers, moving into paying higher marginal rates of tax than we've seen before. That's something happening at the UK level, but it's particularly pronounced in Scotland. So what I've got here is just showing you the number of higher rate taxpayers. So people who are paying at least a higher rate tax, so people who are paying higher rate tax and above for Scotland and also for England. And if you go back to 2016-17, so when we started fiscal devolution and tax devolution, there were around about 300,000 people in Scotland who were paying at least the higher rate of tax. So 304,000 people there. We project that next year that will be over 800,000. And by the end of the decade, that'll be close to 950,000 people in Scotland will be paying the 42 pence rate at least in terms of their income tax. And that's taking the proportion of taxpayers up from around about 12% of taxpayers in Scotland being higher rate taxpayers to over 25%. So next year, 26.3% of people of taxpayers in Scotland paying the higher rate of tax, which is a really interesting shift in the base and the dynamics of our tax system. You can see a similar increase in the rest of the UK, but it's not as pronounced as it is in Scotland. So many more people who may have not seen themselves as higher rate taxpayers historically are now becoming higher rate taxpayers as a result of the continuation of the freeze in these thresholds. And Chris, just to finish, just a quick word on Social Security and what are the trends that we're seeing here in Social Security. Again, there's a lot of movement and some interesting dynamics about UK policy decisions. But overall, what we're seeing is that Social Security spending is increasing. So increasing over the course of our forecast period to be above £9 billion by the turn of the decade. And as we know, the Scottish Government gets funding for a large part of those payments because they're now essentially the UK government is now no longer paying for these benefits because they're now devolved. So they transfer an equivalent amount to the Scottish Government to pay for these benefits. But the Scottish Government, through various choices, has chosen to add additional spending on top of that. That's things like the Scottish Child Payment. That's things like mitigating the bedroom tax. But it's also about delivering a new system of Social Security that has led to an additional inflow of people claiming for certain benefits relative to what otherwise would have been the case, relative to what would have been the case in PIP. Again, that's an entirely appropriate policy choice, and the Scottish Government is trying to set up a more fairer and inclusive system in their view, but it comes with an additional fiscal investment that they have to make. And just one final thing, just to leave you with, Chris, is I guess is one of the really interesting things again with this budget is that while we talk about devolution, we can't ignore the fact that Scotland's fiscal framework is heavily dependent upon decisions that are taken in Westminster, and decisions that are taken in Westminster still have a really quite significant impact on the Scottish Government's budget. So just two things just to highlight here is if you look at the purple line, that was the line that we used back in June to project the difference between funding that was flowing in to the Scottish budget to pay for Social Security and how much the Scottish Government was going to be spending on Social Security. And that was looking at a gap of close to 2 billion by the end of the decade, relative to the kind of funding that was there. And that was going to be a big and still, you know, a number like that would be a big draw on the Scottish Government's budget. But a couple of things have happened since then. Interestingly, these things that have happened haven't been in Scotland. So you know that the government, UK government, had planned to do quite significant reforms to personal independence payment to make some savings, and it goes through welfare reform and make some quite significant cutbacks to disability payments in the rest of the UK. They've now reversed those. They now don't plan to do those things. And because they're not planning to do cuts, that means more money will now flow through to the Scottish Government's budget, nearly about £500 million relative to what otherwise would have been the case. And then most recently, there has been the debate around the two-child limit and the effects of that. The Scottish Government had said they were going to mitigate that. That would have cost them, £150 million to do that. What's happened is that the UK government have now said that they'll do that themselves, and that has enabled the Scottish government to save that money and to spend it on other things. So it's a really good example of one of where the Scottish budget is still subject to quite significant swings in their outlook, depending upon UK government decisions and government choices in there. We still think there is going to be higher spending relative to the funding, but UK government decisions around reversing some of their welfare reforms has made that challenge, at least for now, less significant than it was back in June. So Chris, if it's okay, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and I'm more than happy to pick up any questions. And of course, we're more than happy to share these slides with anyone who would be interested in seeing them.
Thank you very much for that, Graeme. I should say I'm pleased we're having this conversation after Christmas rather than before, just for the national mood and the mood of the audience. I suppose, just to start, this is obviously a pre-election budget. And while all budgets are political, the pre-election budget tends to be more political than most. And from what I can see from your projections, the spending has been sort of front-loaded for the next year, which allows the SNP to say, or the government to say, we're spending this here and there. And then after that, the numbers are pretty grim. How would you characterise the budget overall in that sense of the intentions and how it compares to other budgets that we've had?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and interesting. I mean, some of the stuff about the front loading, some of that is because the UK government are also front loading, and you'll know there's lots of conversations about, well, how realistic might be, the UK government plans to be making significant savings to spending close to a UK election that will be coming toward the end of their spending review. So some of the picture we're seeing here is a reflection of the picture that is existing at the UK level. And I think so. What the Scottish government are really, trying to do is that they've got a really tight funding envelope, and they're essentially using lots of different mechanisms to try and boost the spending as much as they can over the next few years. So you see things like putting money into the reserve this year in order to basically use additional spending next year. They're opening up again the Crown Estate revenues. So spoken before about the Scotland revenues. So these one-off payments for the granting of licenses for offshore renewables. There was a lot of discussion in the past about, well, does it make sense to use one-off revenues that you're using to sell a natural asset or access to a natural asset for day-to-day spending? And the government moved away from that last year to put more money into capital. But interestingly, they're moving back to using some of that revenue for day-to-day resource spending. And I think what the government's counter argument to your point would be is that the funding envelope is so tight that actually they're having to use any resources possible to try and boost up, because growth of 1% in real terms is an exceptionally tight fiscal landscape when you've got pressures in health, challenges in universities, colleges, money crying out for economic development. It's a difficult balancing act. So they're using all available tools possible to try and increase the funding that's available to them.
And you've been warning at the Fiscal Commission and Audit Scotland and Fraser of Allender and others that the spending levels that we're at and the projected increases in the demand on spending are probably unsustainable in the well, not even the long term, but the medium term, maybe even the short. By the end of this decade, the numbers start to look really quite grotesque. There didn't seem to be much in the budget on economic growth or measures that would improve economic growth, or necessarily on the longer term challenges that we face. Now it's a budget, so it's about spending, but equally, there wasn't a lot of we're going to stop doing this, we're going to stop doing that. There was probably some stuff there in terms of capital spending would have pushed some stuff further down the priority list. But just given the approach that the Fiscal Commission's been taking to the near and longer future, does it concern you that governments and maybe the opposition parties as well are still not wrestling with this approaching, I won't use the phrase cliff edge, but approaching crunch that we're facing? And it still feels very much like it's about, right, how do we find every bit of money that we possibly can and shovel it out the door, rather than how do we actually rethink what the purpose of government is and where we're spending our money and where we can no longer afford to do that.
Yeah, and it's a very big question, and I think from our perspective, I think when you look at some of the big long-term challenges coming down the line, you're right. These are challenges that can't just be met by, a bit of additional money here, or hoping you can suck it up over the long term, because the population is aging. We've got big commitments on climate change to deal with. So real prioritization of some long-term structural changes that need to take place. So I mean, the one thing that I think is a step forward, and again, you can pick holes in it and think you can do things better. But I think the one step forward, which I think is encouraging, is that the government have published a spending review. So for the next few years. Now, we might say, well, how realistic is it and what are the different components in it? But the fact that we now have numbers and they're now opening up to a conversation with public bodies and the public sector at large about this is a settlement beyond next year, the next few years, see where you can go. And you can then start to see things like what the challenges might be in local government and other areas with limited money around. And secondly, is this point about efficiency savings, the fact that they're now essentially targeting themselves in terms of this 1.5 billion efficiency savings and cutting the size of the public sector workforce. I said key will be the proof in that. Like, how can you actually deliver that? How do you monitor it? How do you then prove that you've made the efficiency savings that you said you would do? But the fact that they're now talking about that, I think that is now a central part to the budget conversation, does suggest that there's at least being a step forward in the debate around the need for budgets, not just to be about how you spend money, but actually about linked to much bolder reforms and how we deliver public services.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You mentioned winners and losers in terms of departmental spending over this year and the few years ahead, but I suppose thinking about the voters as well, the sort of winners and losers there. And if we talk about fiscal drag, and you mentioned nurses and teachers being drawn into the higher rates of tax because the thresholds aren't changing. And I suppose one of the arguments in Scotland has been, because we've raised taxes on higher earners, that there aren't enough of them to really fund any substantial extra spending, if that indeed is what the elected government of the day wants to do, and that actually to really raise revenue, if you're not going to do it through economic growth, or you're unable to do it through economic growth, is to take money from the broad general population, the sort of middle bit, if you like, where ultimately most of that money is going to come from. Is there a sense that the government's doing that without really having that conversation with the Scottish people, by simply freezing those thresholds and drawing people like public sector workers into that? And is that not really a conversation we need to have as a nation, rather than almost the stealthy approach to it?
Mm. I think it's a really interesting question, because I think, for people like us, we kind of look at thresholds and we kind of understand them and we get quite interested in trends there. But it's the sort of thing, is it's quite hard for, I think, for normal people really to see what's happening. I mean, you can see your council tax bill very visibly. You know what's happening there. You know what's happening if you change the actual rate of income tax. But seeing it through how your pay increases and how you move into higher bands, I think is much more difficult for people to see. And it's been a tactic the UK government and previous UK governments and current UK government and Scottish government have used to essentially raise revenue. And you're right, freezing things like the higher rate threshold and getting more people in, because that is where you've got a large proportion of your tax base. People like that moving into paying, instead of paying, 22 pence in income tax, paying 42 pence in income tax, or England being, instead of paying 20 pence, paying 40 pence. So it's a way of raising quite significantly more revenue over a much broader base. Of course, we have that quirk in Scotland where people who are unfortunate in the sense that they move into the higher rate of tax don't just pay the higher rate of tax, but they also still pay the higher rate of national insurance. So you've got people in that bracket of just between 43,500 and just over 50,000, facing a marginal tax rate of 50%. So there's a bit of an interesting irony in the sense that you get public sector workers now in the higher rate band, in that kind of point between 43,500 and 50,000, having higher pay awards, but actually then being taxed at a marginal rate of 50%. So it's kind of all going in a bit of a cycle.
And on the sort of tax situation, I mean the tax situation has changed in that the SNP have given it by by raising the threshold for the basic and intermediate rates. You get a tax cut of about £3 a month on average, I think, which doesn't seem huge. I mean, that's sort of, I remember Gordon Brown getting laughed at for his penny and whatever, but it's not going to make a huge amount of difference to really anyone's life. And it did seem a bit more about allowing the government to claim that the majority of Scottish taxpayers would be paying less than they would be elsewhere in the UK. So 55%, I think, is the claim. That also means that the 45%, I guess, are paying more. And someone on 50k will pay nearly £1,500 more than elsewhere in the UK. If you've got 80 grand coming in, you'll pay £2,300 more or thereabouts. Is there any sort of suggestion that that's having an impact on decisions that are being taken by companies, by individuals who might want to come here or have the choice of coming here or going elsewhere? But where are we on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the questions I'd love to be able to give a really simple answer. The challenge is that it's actually really difficult to know for a variety of reasons. One is because it's very difficult to think about what's the counterfactual, what would have happened if you hadn't set these particular tax policies. And also as well, we do have to remember that, yes, you're paying more tax, but there's also then more spend in the economy than otherwise would have been. So there's a redistribution of resource rather than it being taken away and not coming back into the economy. And what we know is that what we do is we basically make our forecasts on the assumption that that particularly for higher earners, quite a significant amount of the additional tax is being trying to be raised will actually be reduced by the fact that people will change their behavior as a result of that. Now, that sometimes in the press gets characterized as migration and people up sticks and move away. It tends not really to be that. It tends to be, putting more money into your pension, or going down to a 4.5 day a week or 4 day week, or you're retiring early. It tends to be more of these marginal decisions where we think the effects will be. But yeah, and then we can track anecdotal evidence about whether or not companies are finding that it's more difficult to recruit in Scotland or whatever. But in general, it's one of these things where it's still kind of one of the things on the one hand versus the other, about whether or not it's having an impact or not.
Please do keep your questions coming in because I'm going to come to them really soon. Public sector pay was, a thing that you talked about at a bit of length, and it's undeniable that the Scottish government's been generous when it comes to public sector pay settlements, which has had an impact on the public finances. And I think just this week or at the weekend, junior doctors or resident doctors, as they're now called, have been offered a 4.25% pay rise, 25-26. Then a 3.7% increase in 26-27. But the BMA is saying the overall contractual investment package will mean it will be closer to 10% in both of those years. And that will take up quite a big share of the extra NHS spend in this budget as well, I think. So overall, public sector pay is putting some of this strain on the public finances. And you're creating expectations there for the years ahead as well. If they think that you would rather buy them off than deal with industrial unrest or whatever that might be, if you're not going to negotiate hard for perhaps a new contractual arrangements in order to get that pay rise. How challenging is this going to be in the years ahead, given the emphasis that's been put on basically just looking after the public sector? I mean, there's a lot of people in the private sector who are not getting those kind of increases at all.
Yeah. I mean, on a really basic level, I mean, I've talked a lot about the portfolios in there, but actually, if you just look at it in terms of pay, pay accounts for around about half of the overall Scottish Government budget. So if the government choose to decide to pay more on public sector pay relative to their pay policies, or to try and be more generous in terms of, awards to the public sector, with that funding envelope that I told you of like 1% real terms growth, that means you're going to have to take it from the other part of the budget. And the other part of the budget is the payment of services and actually how you actually run that. So the more you put into public sector wages, that has an implication in terms of your ability to deliver when you've got such a tight funding settlement that exists there, which I think is quite interesting in that the narrative has certainly changed within the government around the size of the public sector and being quite open about the fact that the size of the public sector workforce will shrink over the next few years. And as I said, that is it kind of it's okay to say that, but how do you actually do that, particularly if you're focused on non-frontline workers? Who are they? How are you going to do it? Does it mean redundancies, or is it no compulsory redundancies? Is it linked to reform? What happens to the services that are dependent on those? And I think that's going to be one of the really interesting things over the next few years, because it goes against the trend that we've seen in recent years of growing public sector workforce numbers.
And certainly reading your report yesterday, that was one of the passages that stood out, that you seemed somewhat sceptical that the government's going to meet that 1.5 billion target. Is that fair?
Well, again, and this is again the point what we're saying is that it's okay to say these things. Key is actually delivering it, and then providing the evidence that you have delivered it, because the spending envelope, even for health, is really tight. So a 1 billion increase over 5 years. So that is predicated, you would assume, on the basis of them delivering their £1.5 billion worth of efficient, well, their equivalent of their share of the £1.5 billion worth of efficiency savings. Again, it's just a question that we would ask, which is, well, what happens if you don't deliver on those efficiency savings? Is that 1 billion that you've allocated enough? And if not, what are you going to do differently? And I think that's where I think, again, the kind of proof is going to be about how you deliver those. And again, the one thing I would say is, to be fair to the government, the fact that they're now talking in this language of efficiencies underpinning the budget, talking about efficiencies within the overall context of a spending review, certainly seems like a step forward, because it's not just about here is more money and then some kind of hand waving about efficiency savings. It is at least a step forward that they're now talking about these being linked.
Well, thank goodness for Ivan McKee, I guess I'd say. Now, I'd like to take some questions from the audience. Alistair Veach, do you want to ask yours?
I can definitely try if I could. Yeah, if I could find the microphone button, I'll be there in a minute. Yeah, I mean, it's written on the chat, but how far do you think the budget goes towards? I guess the multi-year spending plan goes towards tackling the current and future fiscal challenges detailed by the Auditor General. And they're obviously quite severe, and I'm just curious to know how you see the projections, whether that's changed significantly in your mind. And also, I guess, you've touched upon this as well, but how realistic are the spending plans versus likely requirements? The NHS, I mean, even the government has admitted that they have a 3% sort of real growth requirement, and they're even by the numbers that we're seeing, they're well below that. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, do you fundamentally think that rationing of other services and productivity really fills the gap? And finally, I guess, what are the upside downside risks to the revenue generation? And did the current budget change that in any way?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. I mean, so again, this kind of touches a bit on some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, in the sense that, so the nature of a spending review or a budget is always naturally going to be short term, and it's not really the place that you would expect to see, a big, kind of clear messages or a clear fiscal adjustment to what might happen over the long term. But I guess the question, which I guess that we ask and the Auditor General has asked as well, is that, okay, this might be your allocation for health for next year, but what's the plan beyond the next 3 to 4 years? What's the plan over the medium to long term? And the work that we've done essentially just takes current expenditure and just rolls the age profile of the population forward. And you see the demand, the huge demands that are going to be needed there, just simply to cope with the fact that the aging population there. So I think for me, that's maybe less about a budget or spending review and much more into a detailed conversation that needs to take place more broadly about how we're actually going to fund public services that would depend upon over the medium to long term. So I would, if you ask, was there stuff in the budget that would give you the reassurance that that is in play? No. But in some ways, I wouldn't expect a budget to be exactly that. But we really need to have more information coming from government and, to be fair, other opposition parties as well about what they would plan to do to essentially balance the books over the medium to long term. And in terms of the revenue generation, again as well, one of the things that again we highlight within the report, and this isn't just a Scottish issue, but it's a UK issue, is that the revenue generation growth, the growth in our revenues, the growth in our economy is way behind where it has been historically. And all of this conversation we're having about the kind of really difficult funding envelope that we face comes from an economy that hasn't been generating tax-rich growth since the financial crisis, and that's Scotland, but it's also the UK. And so yes, the government can add more freeze thresholds, get a bit more, put an additional band on council tax, etc. But it's relatively small beer relative to what we need to do, which is get the economy growing at a faster rate, which means that you don't have to freeze thresholds because you've got earnings growth that is so rich and buoyant that means that your tax base that you've got at the moment, your tax structure you've got, is actually generating the revenue. You don't have to go through other ways to take more of the share of the earnings growth because earnings growth is so strong. And that's a challenge that the UK government has faced, the Scottish government has faced. It seems to be, just really difficult to turn around. Is how do we get our economy generating tax-rich growth?
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just going to go through a few questions here, if people don't mind me asking them on their behalf. But Mandy Boswell, she asks about suggestions central government are making to local councils to make such significant savings. Now, I'm not sure that you would know about that, but we didn't really touch on well, you did, but I didn't on local government, and I think they're getting a 2% real terms rise over the next few years, but actually that's not going to allow them to stand still, even in terms of the services that are providing. We're all waiting for our council tax bills to pop through the letterbox, which look like there'll be another 8 to 10% or whatever as they were last year. And Bill McCall says, is it a fair observation that local authority funding is significantly impacted as well? So I just wonder if you could maybe just talk a bit more about the consequences for local government, because it's something that we as a think tank obviously are very focused on. Council tax is an issue. There's a new mansion tax coming in for properties over £1 million, but not necessarily the powers being passed to councils to manage and decide this stuff for themselves.
Yeah, so a couple of just quick things that we've got a couple of charts in the report which show you, I guess, what's happening to local government. And one of these is that the local government settlement for next year is up. So there's more money going into local government. But if you look at the overall resource profile, what happens after that is that's when the budget gets tighter. So back to your point, Chris, about more money now, but then kind of more pain later. And that's where the big challenge comes for local government. So that chart I showed you about what's happening to portfolios, you see health going up, social justice or social security going up, but then local government going down and picking up the biggest share of the overall adjustment. We've also got a couple of tables where we show the share of the budget that is allocated to local government, and you see that going down over the course of the spending review. So it's a tough settlement for local government overall.
Yeah, and Ian McCall says the budget says health and social care services will, among other things, focus on prevention. We're back to one of our favourite subjects again. How likely are they to be able to achieve this? And you cross your fingers, and we've been hoping for the best part of 20 years now that's going to happen. I didn't see a huge amount in the budget that suggested that was looming as a finally getting a policy choice made there.
No, and again, to be fair, I guess in some ways you might not expect a macro budget which sets out the overall envelope to do that, but you're right. And again, these allocations they've given to are predicated on making quite bold and big efficiency savings within there. And that gets back to, I guess, the first question, which is really well made as well, about what is how are you going to deal with these, pressures that are coming down the line and the need to shift. And I guess the challenge is that if you've got really tight settlements, how do you invest in the things that we know that are important for prevention when you've basically got to keep the lights on? And that's the question which Chris and you and your colleagues have looked at. How do you actually stop doing things in order to do things that you need to do? And that's been the challenge within the policy debate for many years now.
I suppose one of the other things, and maybe a good thing to come from the budget, is that colleges are getting £70 million, and unis will get a bit more. So in terms of economic growth, in terms of tackling the skills gap, in terms of some of the questions that employers have been asking and maybe thinking about how we structure education system. But I guess the question would be there, is that enough to address the problem we have in our tertiary education system in terms of deficits and even the existential problems facing some institutions?
Yeah, and I guess the question is, how sustained is this additional investment? Because the government haven't really spelt out what happens beyond the next financial year. So the spending review, provides some detail at a macro level, but doesn't really go into the detail down to, higher education, and colleges in that kind of really level of detail about what might happen. So 70 million, again, to support innovation and shore up colleges and get them on a sustainable position. The question is, well, what about the next year, the year after, when that budgets are going to be particularly tight? So again, it shows more money's been invested. Key will be is what happens to that and what is the overall plan. And I know there's a review into higher education in Scotland, because putting more money for 1 year is only kind of just stopping the gap, which might come later on.
The other thing that was in the budget that caught my eye was this pipeline for capital projects, where obviously, because the capital budget's been cut by £1 billion or whatever it is, and looking ahead, that might not necessarily improve. So the A9 dualling will go ahead. Of course it will. I've been hearing that for a while. There'll be a railway station at Winchborough. These projects are being prioritised, but then other things like, I guess, national care centres bring down waiting times, look like they've been pushed back a bit. I suppose one of the interesting things to ask you as an economist is, in terms of capital investment and its impact on economic growth and its prioritisation, are we giving that enough attention and focus?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is no. But it's a UK thing as well. I mean, if you look at some of the arguments about UK productivity and UK and how much we invest as a country overall, then we historically invest much less than our key competitors. And the Scottish Government budget still depends so heavily on that outlook for the capital DEL budget. So the Barnett consequentials come through. And it was always quite a puzzling thing with the UK budget, where they front loaded so much in capital expenditure, and then there was the kind of fall off towards the end. And it'll be interesting to see whether that profile changes at a UK level over the next few years. It obviously opens up some questions, which I know, Chris, you've touched on before as well, about things like, how do you start to move into more innovative funding models for capital investment projects? So how do you move into more revenue-based models? How do you move into accessing pension funds? Because if that's the outlook of, after this year, sustained cuts in capital investment, and we know we need big investment in transport projects, we know we need big investment in projects that are going to help support demographic change and net zero, doesn't strike you that there's a consistency there between capital budgets going down and capital demands going up?
Well, we're pretty much out of time. I suppose I've got one last question, which is a bit more general, but you and I have been talking for a good few years, Audit Scotland as well, and as I said, Fraser Allender, the IFS and others. And you're all saying the same thing, and we're saying the same thing at Enlighten, that basically we can't go on like this. We are going to have to make some hard decisions, and we can't carry on as if the financial crash didn't happen and as if our growth projections are better than they are, and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know how you would answer this or feel able to answer it, but do you feel that you are being listened to when you release these reports, and you put the projections out there. It's okay, they're projections, but nevertheless they're based on the best data available to us. They're posing big questions about the future of the nation, not just to the government, but to the opposition parties as well. So to the political class as a whole, do you feel it's sinking home and that you can see evidence that they are getting that and are willing to actually tackle some of this stuff on a longer term basis?
Yeah. So I think the honest answer is that I think it's mixed. So I think there are pockets of MSPs and pockets of the public sector that really get this and they're really thinking innovatively about how they would respond to it. So I've always been impressed by whenever we go in front of the finance committee, for example, all around cross-party, they really get it and they really understand it and they can see what is coming. I think once you go out more broadly into the kind of broader political debate, then the kind of levels of engagement in these sorts of things is mixed at best. I think for me, I think where we are seeing bits of improvement. There's a positive and negative. I think on the negative side, I think most people can now see public services straining. They can see it. You go back to the Christie, and Christie talked about the looming demographics. We're actually in it now. You can see what's happening to the health service because of the demand coming through and having an impact on what we can deliver. I think on the positive side, the fact that we have had a spending review, we can be critical about how much detail it is and whether we'd like to have more, and the fact that the government are talking about efficiency savings and talking about reform and talking about the size and shape of the public sector workforce seems to me, you might think I'm too optimistic. It seems to me that the conversation has moved on one step to where we were perhaps this time last year. It's certainly only one step on a long road that we need to go down.
Yeah, well, that's very wise. Well, listen, Graeme, thank you so much for your time and for such an elucidation of the budget and the issues that we face. And I hope you've all enjoyed that. And thank you very much for joining us. And I look forward, Graeme, to doing this again the next time there's some kind of financial event.
Right.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.